In just 34 seconds, one simple question about the Constitution exposed FBI Director Kash Patel's shocking ignorance of basic American law before 89 million viewers. Senator Jeff Merkley didn't need classified documents or secret evidence. He asked one fundamental question that every FBI director should know. Cameras captured Patel's stammering response. The Senate chamber fell into stunned silence. What constitutional principle did Merkley ask about that made America's top law enforcement official reveal he doesn't understand the basic legal foundation of his own job? April 22, 2025, 417 p.m. Room SD 226 of the Dirksen Senate Office Building. The air thick with the anticipation of what should have been routine questioning about FBI constitutional compliance. Kash Patel walked in like a federal administrator who had perfected the art of bureaucratic confidence. Charcoal suit tailored to Project Law Enforcement Authority. FBI badge catching the lights that would soon illuminate his constitutional ignorance. Behind him followed 4 FBI constitutional lawyers and 2 DOJ legal advisors. Their briefcases containing prepared responses about FBI procedures and federal law enforcement protocols. What they hadn't prepared for was a senator who would test whether the FBI director understood the most basic principles of American constitutional law. The morning briefing had been routine. Patel's chief of staff had outlined expected questions about FBI budget allocations, counterterrorism operations, and administrative reforms. Nothing challenging today, Director. His aide had assured him, with the confidence of someone who had never imagined a constitutional literacy test. Standard oversight questions about operational procedures and congressional cooperation. Across the mahogany table sat Senator Jeff Merkley, looking like a constitutional law professor who had spent decades teaching the fundamental principles that Patel was about to reveal he had never learned. His eyes carried the focused intensity of someone who understood that the FBI director's job required absolute mastery of constitutional law, and he was about to test whether Patel possessed even basic knowledge of the document that governed his authority. The preparation for this moment had been meticulous. Merkley's staff had spent weeks analyzing Patel's confirmation hearings, his public statements, and his legal background. What they discovered was troubling. A pattern of constitutional references that seemed memorized rather than understood. Legal citations that appeared copied rather than comprehended. Senator, his chief counsel had warned during preparation, if Patel really doesn't know basic constitutional law, this could be devastating. The FBI director position requires absolute mastery of constitutional principles. We're not talking about complex legal theory. We're talking about foundational knowledge that every federal agent possesses. The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber buzzed with routine energy. Political reporters expected standard questions about FBI operations and congressional oversight. C-SPAN's live feed carried what everyone assumed would be a predictable exchange about federal law enforcement procedures. No one anticipated they were about to witness the most embarrassing display of constitutional ignorance in FBI history. At exactly 4:17 p.m., Chairman Dick Durbin recognized Senator Merkley for his questioning period. The senator from Oregon is recognized for 15 minutes. The time allocation seemed routine, but Merkley would need less than 1 minute to completely destroy Patel's credibility. The chamber's atmosphere was deceptively calm. Republican senators expected softball questions that would allow Patel to showcase FBI achievements. Democratic senators anticipated tough policy questions about civil liberties and federal overreach. None expected the academic precision that was about to expose fundamental incompetence. Patel opened with confidence, expecting questions about FBI budget allocations or administrative policies. Senator Merkley, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the FBI's critical work protecting Americans while upholding our constitutional principles, and democratic values. The prepared statement rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. His media training had prepared him for hostile questions about FBI operations, controversial investigations, and partisan criticism, but no amount of media coaching could prepare him for what was coming. Merkley looked up from his notes with the expression of a professor about to administer a pop quiz to an unprepared student. Director Patel, since you mentioned constitutional principles, let me ask you a fundamental question. What does the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution say? The question seemed almost insultingly simple. Every law student, police officer, and federal agent knew the Fourth Amendment by heart. It was the constitutional foundation of all FBI investigative work, the basic legal principle that governs search and seizure authority. In the gallery, constitutional law professors watched with growing interest. Professor Sarah Chun from Georgetown Law whispered to her colleague, "This is either going to be routine or devastating. There's no middle ground with constitutional basics." Patel's confident expression flickered slightly. He had expected complex questions about FBI procedures, not basic constitutional recitation. "Senator, the Fourth Amendment relates to search and seizure protections and the requirement for judicial oversight of federal investigative activities. That's a description of what it does," Merkley replied with the precision of a constitutional scholar. "I asked what it says. Can you quote the Fourth Amendment?" The chamber began to sense something significant was happening. Merkley wasn't asking about policy interpretations or legal complexities. He was testing whether the FBI director knew the actual text of the constitutional provision that governed his entire agency's authority. Behind Patel, his legal advisors began exchanging worried glances. FBI General Counsel Amanda Morrison felt her stomach drop as she realized where this was heading. Every FBI agent memorized the Fourth Amendment during training. If their director couldn't quote it, the implications were catastrophic. Patel paused, clearly struggling. "Senator, the Fourth Amendment establishes that American citizens have protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and that judicial warrants are required for federal investigative actions." Director Merkley interrupted with growing intensity. "I'm not asking for a paraphrase. I'm asking if you can quote the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. You're the FBI director. This is the legal foundation of everything your agency does. Can you recite it?" The silence that followed was devastating. Patel sat speechless for nearly 10 seconds, clearly unable to quote the constitutional provision that governed his entire agency's operations. His legal team behind him looked panicked. Realizing their director was about to be exposed as constitutionally on live television, television viewers across America began to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. Political commentators would later describe it as the moment when basic competence became a public spectacle. Social media feeds started lighting up with constitutional text as viewers provided the quotes their FBI director couldn't. Senator Patel finally said, his voice betraying uncertainty. "The specific wording involves protections against unreasonable searches and their requirement for warrants based on probable cause, but I don't have the exact constitutional text memorized word for word." The admission was staggering. The FBI director had just confessed that he couldn't quote the Fourth Amendment, the constitutional provision that every FBI agent was required to know by heart. "You don't have it memorized?" Merkley repeated with devastating precision. "Director, every police officer in America knows the Fourth Amendment. Every FBI agent under your command knows it. But you, as FBI director, don't have it memorized." The comparison was brutal and accurate. Policemen required constitutional memorization. FBI training demanded perfect recitation. Yet the director of the FBI couldn't perform the basic task required of every rookie agent. Patel's face was now visibly flushed. Senator, my role involves overseeing complex federal operations that encompass numerous constitutional provisions and legal frameworks beyond specific textual memorization. Constitutional provisions beyond specific textual memorization. Merkley echoed with academic precision. Director, let me help you. The Fourth Amendment says, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched, and the persons or things to be seized, as Merkley recited the amendment perfectly. The contrast became stark. A senator knew the constitutional text that the FBI director couldn't quote. Now, Director, Merkley continued, since I had to teach you the Fourth Amendment, let me ask about the First Amendment. Can you quote the First Amendment to the Constitution? The second constitutional test was even more devastating. If Patel couldn't quote the Fourth Amendment, could he quote any constitutional provision? Patel sat in visible distress, clearly unable to quote the First Amendment either. Senator, the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, religion, press, and assembly, along with the right to petition government. That's a summary, Merkley shot back immediately. I asked for the text. Can you quote the First Amendment? Another devastating silence. The FBI director couldn't quote the First Amendment either. Senator Patel said, his voice now clearly strained. While I understand the principles and applications of constitutional law, I don't have specific amendments memorized verbatim. You don't have them memorized, Merkley repeated with controlled fury. Director, you swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. How can you defend something you can't even quote? The question struck at the heart of Patel's fundamental unfitness for office. He had sworn a constitutional oath to defend a document he apparently had never bothered to learn. Social media erupted as viewers watched the FBI director's constitutional ignorance exposed in real time. Patel Constitution began trending alongside FBI director. Fail and constitutional ignorance. The story was exploding beyond the hearing room into a national conversation about Patel's basic qualifications. Director Merkley pressed with academic precision. Let me try one more. Can you quote the 14th Amendment, the 5th Amendment? Any amendment to the Constitution? Patel sat in stunned silence, clearly unable to quote any constitutional provision. The FBI director had been exposed as constitutionally illiterate on live television. Senator Patel finally managed. My legal training focuses on the practical application of constitutional principles, rather than textual memorization of specific provisions. Practical application, Merkley repeated with devastating effect. Director, how can you apply constitutional principles you can't even quote? How can you lead an agency that enforces constitutional law when you don't know what the Constitution says? The questions were unanswerable. Patel had been exposed as fundamentally unquil for a position that required absolute mastery of constitutional law. Let me ask you something simpler. Merkley continued with the patience of a teacher dealing with a failing student. How many amendments are there to the Constitution? Even this basic civics question seemed to challenge Patel. He paused for several seconds before answering uncertainly. 27 amendments, Senator. Good, Merkley said with mock congratulation. You got one answer right. Now, can you name the first 10 amendments? Patel's silence was deafening. The FBI director couldn't name the Bill of Rights. Director, Merkley said, his voice rising with controlled outrage. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. They're the foundation of American civil liberties. You're the FBI director, and you can't name the Bill of Rights. The constitutional ignorance was comprehensive and shocking. Patel didn't just lack detailed knowledge. He lacked basic civics education that every high school student should possess. Senator Patel attempted desperately. My focus has been on operational leadership and federal law enforcement management rather than constitutional memorization. Constitutional memorization, Merkley shot back with academic theory. Director, this isn't memorization. This is basic knowledge that every American should have. You're running the FBI, and you don't know the Constitution. The chamber was now in complete shock. Committee members stared in disbelief as the FBI director's constitutional ignorance was systematically exposed through simple questions that any civic-minded citizen should be able to answer. Director Merkley said, preparing his final assault, "Let me ask you the most basic question of all. What document begins with the words, 'We the people'?" Patel managed to answer correctly. "The Constitution, Senator." "Excellent," Merkley replied with devastating sarcasm. "Can you quote the praying fool to the Constitution?" Another silence. The FBI director couldn't quote the praying bowl either. Director Merkley concluded with finality, "You can't quote the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, or any constitutional provision. You can't name the Bill of Rights. You can't quote the pray. You have sworn an oath to defend a document you clearly have never read. How do you expect the American people to trust you to protect their constitutional rights when you don't know what those rights are?" The final question was devastating in its simplicity and logic. How could someone protect constitutional rights they couldn't even identify? Patel sat in defeated silence, unable to provide any response that wouldn't further expose his constitutional ignorance. His legal team looked mortified, realizing that no amount of preparation could overcome their director's fundamental lack of basic civics knowledge. "I have no further questions," Merkley said quietly. His work complete, the chamber remained in stunned silence as the full scope of Patel's constitutional ignorance became clear. The FBI director had been exposed as fundamentally unqualified for his position through questions that any high school civics student should be able to answer. As Patel eventually gathered himself to leave the hearing room, he left behind not just a destroyed career, but the most embarrassing display of constitutional ignorance in federal law enforcement history. Senator Jeff Merkley had accomplished something remarkable. He had proven that America's FBI director didn't understand the basic legal foundation of American democracy. That evening, as America processed the most shocking constitutional moment in congressional history, one thing was abundantly clear. Kash Patel's career was over. Not because of corruption or scandal, but because he had been exposed as fundamentally ignorant of the Constitution he had sworn to defend. The 34 seconds that destroyed Kash Patel's career would be remembered as the moment when basic civic knowledge became a job requirement for America's highest law enforcement positions.